Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is John Nickerson, and I am a forester with my own consulting firm called Dogwood Springs Forestry. And you are here to attend probably the hottest panel of the whole conference, and that is a pun. We're here to talk about reining in the adverse environmental impacts of extreme wildfires. And since this is a climate-related conference, one of those adverse environmental impacts that will be brought up today will be emissions from wildfire. And it's about this time every year that we start looking around the hills here. I live up in Northern California and see them starting to turn brown, and we get that funny feeling in our stomach that, uh-oh, here it comes again. Last year was quite an incredible season for wildfires, where we had burned in the state of California on both public and private lands. And some people say that that is about the amount of acres that burned in pre-European times. But the one big difference is that fires of today are much more higher in intensity than prehistoric fires. It's estimated that in pre-European times that the emissions associated with wildfire was up to 62.6 teragrams, but a range between 23.1 and 62.6. And last year's emissions, estimated by the Air Resources Board, are estimated to be at 112 million teragrams of carbon dioxide equivalent. And these problems that we're having in California we're seeing similar trends throughout the Western United States, and then there's also Australia. So we've got a problem that we've got to deal with. And we've got a great panel to discuss this today. I will introduce them briefly. This session is going to talk about policies and actions that are helping to reduce environmental risk, and especially those associated with a focus on greenhouse gas emissions. And it will also be discussing the role that the private sector can play in making a difference. And the reason that we're bringing this up is because the Climate Action Reserve is currently exploring the development of a quantification methodology that could bring private funding into fuels management. So to talk about this today, we have Malcolm North. Malcolm is a research ecologist at the Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. He's an affiliate professor at UC Davis, and he's focused a lot of his career on carbon dynamics of fuel treatments and wildfire. Carol Ekarius is joining us from Colorado. Thanks for making the journey out here. And with a long interest in sustainable agriculture and small-scale farming. She's the executive director for the Coalition of the Upper South Platte in Colorado, and it's a collaborative group. And she's been involved in forest health projects with a focus on community values and economic sustainability. We also have Matt Hurteau. Matt is a professor with the University of New Mexico, and he will focus on, he has a focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation in forest systems. So the format of today's panel is each speaker will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll save some time for questions from the audience. I also have a few questions for our panelists as well. Today, we're going to start with Malcolm. And Malcolm, would you please talk about the current conditions and what is being done to create more resilient forests?
Right, thank you, John. Yeah, I'm going to try to have a quick thumbnail to provide some context for the issues in this. And I guess I would start first and foremost to point out that the forest type that we're really talking about here is forests that historically, i.e. before the arrival of Europeans, had a frequent low to moderate severity fire regime. High elevation forests are a different subject, and much of the burning problem that we have, for instance, in California and chaparral and coastal oak systems is again a different story. But today, we're talking really about extreme wildfires, particularly in the forests that can grow really large trees, and because of that, can store a lot of carbon. Much of the problem has hinged on the fact that we've been suppressing fires fairly effectively for about 100 years now, and with that, there's been a significant increase in fuel loading into these systems, so that the fire that used to beneficially improve the ecosystem by burning on the surface of the forest floor often now transitions up into the overstory canopy of the forest. And because of that, will often kill most of the trees, if not all of the trees. And particularly relevant to us, will often kill the largest trees in the stand, which is where most of the carbon is. The efforts to reduce that kind of fire transitioning really focus on removing surface fuels and ladder fuels. And ladder fuels are these intermediate sized trees that can transfer the fire into the overstory crowns. And the problem is not simply a fuels reduction, but as we recently learned in California, and it's a trend that's going to be happening pretty much everywhere in the West, is that the increase in density that has happened with fire suppression really increases water competition in these stands. And so in the Sierra Nevadas, we had what some people are suggesting was the worst drought in 1,000 years between 2012 and 16. And that increase in stand density that came from the fire suppression water stressed most of these trees, and bark beetles came in and killed many of them, particularly the largest overstory trees. So there's this consequence that couples with the fire suppression effect that actually increases the fuel loading in the system. And we don't know this for sure yet, but some of the wildfires, particularly the Creek Fire in the Sierra Nevadas, looked like it had extreme fire behavior due to the fact that there was a tremendous amount of fuel loading from this bark beetle mortality that occurred as a consequence of the drought. The second topic I want to talk about is where would we prioritize fuels management work? Where is it most needed? And I think most people in this business would argue right away that the first priority is the WUI, or the wildland urban interface, the forests that are adjacent to homes, because by fuel reducing that area in particular, we can save more structures and reduce human casualties as well. And probably a second point of priority would be likely ignition sources. So you're looking at areas next to roads, ridge tops, and as we've learned, much to our regret in California, power lines in particular are another set priority for these systems. And finally, I guess I'd say there are certain weaknesses in landscapes that really can propagate fire and are often referred to as wicks. And particularly, we're thinking about, in this case, riparian corridors that have a dense amount of fuel loading in them, and areas with concentrated high wind patterns, which is really what happened with the Camp Fire being kind of funneled and accelerated into the town of Paradise. That was the fire that killed 86 people in 2018. So the third point is what can be done to kind of enhance the resiliency of these systems. And fuels and stand density reduction, as I've already mentioned, are probably the most important targets for trying to perpetuate both the stable carbon in the system, but also make the forest stands more resistant and resilient to both fire and drought. But varying the intensity of these treatments is something that managers in particular have keyed into, because we know that some places tend to burn more frequently and hotter than other places. So we would want to have a lower density and lower fuel loading on steeper slopes that are southwest facing, much more likely to burn and burn hotter. And furthermore, we'd want to reduce stand densities and fuel conditions on drier slopes and areas. And particularly in forest ecology, we think about that in terms of a metric called climatic water deficit, which is the difference between how much water the trees could use if water was unlimited versus how much water they actually have. And that gap between the two of them is a pretty good measure of what kind of drought stress you're going to get in the system, as well as kind of how much it can support dry conditions that propagate fire. The fourth thing I want to talk about is to kind of give you some background of how big is the backlog in this system between what we would like to get done in terms of fuels reduction and what we're currently doing. And I'm going to illustrate that point with an area that I've worked in a fair amount to try to give you some numbers to get a sense of what's going on. So I'm talking about the Sierra Nevadas in California here, in which the Forest Service has 13 million acres of land that they manage on it. And ecologists often use this metric of trying to figure out how much of the fuels in that landscape would have been reduced in pre-European periods to try to get a sense of what the natural background of fuels reduction would be. So again, on that 13 million acres we're talking about, we can roughly estimate that it was about 630,000 acres that used to burn each year and have fuels reduced on it. So then what we do is we say, well, what is the Forest Service management doing in terms of treatments to give you a sense of pace and scale? Is it at that 630,000 acre size? And as you can well imagine, it's not even close. We're presently treating, if we're talking about mechanical thinning, prescribed fire, and managed wildfire, there's kind of, depending on how you tally these numbers, it's roughly between about 60 and 90,000 acres per year. So you're looking at about 10 to 15% of where you would want to be. So roughly the current rate of treatment versus where we would like to be is off by an order of magnitude, or about tenfold. And I don't think the Sierras is much different than many of the other national forests that we'd be talking about in the Western United States. The other thing that goes into this is that once you treat an area and you reduce the fuels on it, of course, the forest doesn't stop growing. It starts putting more fuel back into the system. And so again, you can do this calculation to figure out, well, how long is it since you treated it that it's going to be so fuel loaded again that you've got a problem on your hands. And that calculation suggests that at the current pace and scale that we're going at, 2/3 of the forest out there will never even get to. So not only are we off by about an order of magnitude in the pace and scale of what we're doing, but we're also basically building a significant amount of the forest that we can't get to unless we somehow change the rate at which we're doing fuels treatments, and also the way we maintain them, which is actually a huge cost when it comes into starting to do these treatments on a larger scale. The fourth point I want to talk about is kind of what are the ecological benefits in this system. And I'd have to say that besides the fuels reduction making the forest more resistant and resilient to these stresses I've been talking about, both drought and fire, there's also tremendous ecological benefits from the treatments that we're talking about for stabilizing the carbon, because the largest proportions of the carbon are in the big trees. And frankly, by securing those large trees and making them more stable in the system, you have a kind of a repercussion effect on many of the other ecosystem services that we'd like to maintain in the system as well. The large trees are kind of what's called the ecosystem backbone. They provide many of the habitats for some wildlife species. They're important in the nutrient cycling of the system. They're basically the kind of real standard by which the system is sustained. But two other benefits I want to point out in particular that go along with these things is when you're doing these fuels modifications and you're particularly reducing stand density, you actually increase water availability into these stands. And in many dry Western forests, much of the ecosystem processes that go on in the background that actually kind of underpin the way the ecosystem works, things like soil respiration and nutrient cycling, they are limited and depend on soil moisture. And so when you take up all that soil moisture by competition between trees, many of these important ecosystem processes stall. So finally, I guess I'd say one thing that I think science has really shown, but may not be on many people's radar screen, is the other thing that's really important in doing these fuels treatments is you take a forest condition that's fairly homogeneous and you start recreating the heterogeneity that is so important within the system. Having that variable forest conditions of shaded areas, light areas, increases the wildlife habitat, it increases the plant diversity in the system. It basically creates much of the resilience that is really built into those forests and that we've lost with fire suppression. And with that, I'm going to stop here and turn it over. Hopefully that's given you some background about the context of what's going on in many of these forest systems. I'll turn it back over to you, John.
No, thank you, Malcolm. That really sets the stage. You talked a lot about California. I think Colorado is pretty much in the same boat as we are, with the same backlog of work that's needed to be done there. Carol, coming to you now, can you talk about what actions you see taking place to get at this problem and what you think needs to be done?
Sure. Thanks, John. I think, I work with collaborative place-based groups and really have grown to a point where I'm working with groups across the West. And so one of the things I think that we need to talk about is that these issues aren't just a federal lands issue. This is a cross-boundary issue. The numbers in Colorado, for example, the state just did its forest action plan. There's 4 million acres in need of treatment, mitigation, ecological restoration, and that type of work. And that's not, that's boundaryless acres. So we have to start thinking about how we do this work to protect the values we all care about. In 2003, the government passed the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, required communities to start doing community wildfire protection planning. It was great, but we still have made damn little actual progress on the ground at changing the scope of how these fires happen, how big they get. And as climate change is increasing that issue, we need to rethink how we do work. The last couple of years, and I want to say maybe about 2 years ago, USDA requested all of the states to develop a shared stewardship agreement with them. And that said, we're going to actually sit down as federal agencies, the states, and other interested stakeholders and figure out how do we increase the pace and scale of work. But one of the problems is the pace and scale, it's really expensive. In areas where you do have really big trees, maybe Washington State, Oregon, parts of California, the timber value will offset a good cost of the work, if not all of it. Here in Colorado and Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, our states are even drier and we have smaller trees by and large. And so that cost of doing business here is really expensive. A very cheap acre for treatment in Colorado is about $800 an acre, and a very expensive acre is $5,000. So when you're talking, we have a 4 million acre backlog of work to be done, that's a $12 billion price tag. And so I think one of the things we want to see is how do we work collaboratively to increase the pace and scale? How do we remove barriers? I think California has a barrier in their permitting requirements to do thinning on private lands, can require private landowners to get a timber permit and have a professional forester come in and do a forest plan and all, which may make sense on acres that are going to be commercially thinned. But when you're strictly thinning for forest mitigation purposes and you're trying to do the right thing and you're a small landowner, that can become a prohibitive thing. So I think all of us looking together at how do we take out some of those? How do we do other kinds of partnership work more effectively? To me, I work a lot in the nexus of watersheds and wildfire. And so in the last couple of years in Colorado, for example, 2020, we had from 2002 till 2020, the largest fire in Colorado history was the Hayman. Suddenly we have 3 fires in 1 year that exceed the size of the Hayman. And 2 of those in northern Colorado, the Cameron Peak and the East Troublesome fires, they are in critical watersheds that supply 1 million plus people with drinking water, supply most of northern Colorado's ag use of water. So, we need to look at this as a bigger picture of policy and approaches that we can work on together. I believe a lot of the work has to involve local collaborative groups. So stakeholders in a community, they engage, they think about what they want their forests to be in the future. They think about how do we get there. They help develop the social license for the projects, both on public land and private land. A lot of times the Forest Service will tell you one of their big challenges is social license. So they lay out a plan, they come up with a treatment, and then suddenly people come out of the woodwork going, oh, don't cut any trees. But if people are engaged in the design and think about it, that helps improve the likelihood of those projects moving forward faster, not being held up in NEPA appeals and things like that. I think, another one of the things, though, that I'm really interested in and where you and I have met and have started working together, John, is on this idea of, can we use ecosystem service markets, carbon being one, but also water supply and other types of markets for ecosystem services to help fund work. And so how do we start to develop those investments around the carbon value of doing these treatments? As you said in your intro, we know we may be burning the same amount of acres based on modeling that we were burning pre-European Americans, but we're burning much hotter, we're burning at a much higher intensity that's causing much greater damage, not only to greenhouse gas emissions, soil damage, watershed damage, water quality damage. And so using marketplaces that can help us invest in projects is really, to me, an important strategy. It's not going to fund all of it either. We're still going to need public investments. But if we can figure out ways to augment some of our investments with those private sector markets, we've seen it on the water side, like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and the breweries are helping to invest to protect their water supplies. We've seen New Mexico, Santa Fe, the taxpayers, they created a tax on themselves in Santa Fe to help protect their municipal watershed. So we know there's examples of this beginning to be implemented and working. We just need to keep moving that forward. The quicker, the better, to get to a place where we can actually start to change fire behavior. And then we need to think about, how do we restore these landscapes after fire? It's a continuum of work. It's not just a one and done type of project. How do we maintain, if we go in and do mitigation, as Malcolm said, trees regrow. How do we maintain that? Using prescribed fire, using managed wildfire in our landscapes. And so, I think we have to look at where our options, we're looking at projects with biomass utilization, using more wood in buildings like CLT, using biochar. We're actually experimenting at CUSP with a small biochar unit at one of our slash sites now. So we run a slash site, public can bring those ladder fuels and the smaller stuff into the slash site. Then how do we deal with the slash? So we're dinking around. I don't know that this will be a success either, but we've now got a staff person who's making biochar to see if we at least can come up with some product out of that and some better use of it than just burning it or landfilling it or doing things like that with this material. So I think that's probably all for me for right now, and I'll turn over to Matt, and then we can have more open discussion and questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Carol. That was really helpful, and thank you for the segue in talking about carbon markets, because that's where Matt is going to go. Before he gets there, I want to say that we do know that the private sector appears to be willing to invest in these types of activities, but it's not easy. If you think trying to get an improved forest management protocol together, where you have to address all these issues of baseline, additionality, safeguards, and permanence, all these things that are very tricky, it gets pretty hard when you get into the world of looking at the probabilistic nature of wildfires. But thank goodness we have Matt here to solve that for us. He's going to tell us how we, well, at least try to put it into perspective. How do we do these sorts of things with the analysis around wildfire? Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to build on a couple of things. One thing that Malcolm introduced And that's that idea that, basically not all positions within a landscape have the same chance of burning or being a source of wildfire. And then one of the things that Carol said, which is the importance of not getting hung up on political boundaries. So basically, when we think about planning and managing landscapes to mitigate some of the risk of stand replacing fire, we need to be thinking about where those high risk areas lie within a landscape, and we need to think about how fire propagates across that landscape or how it spreads across that landscape. You're not paying any attention whatsoever to political boundaries, right? Because fire does not stop at the fence line, and so management shouldn't either. And so when we think about this in the context of basically managing these landscapes for carbon, it's really in these fire-prone forests, it's thinking about how do we maintain live trees, right? Because it's the live trees that allow that ecosystem to continue to take up carbon out of the atmosphere. And so, we've done work in the Sierra Nevada and also here in the Southern Rockies in New Mexico, where, we look at these, a particular landscape, watershed, fireshed type size landscape, and then run, lots and lots of simulations to try and understand where landscape positions are that are most vulnerable to loss of carbon from wildfire, and then think about how we can allocate treatments across these landscapes in a way that deals with those high probability areas first. And so this gets at the both what Carol and Malcolm were talking about is these things are expensive, these treatments, and we've got a lot of land area that requires treatment. And so we like to think about that in a basically where to leverage positions on the landscape to allocate our money efficiently and achieve an overall reduction in the area that is at risk of high severity wildfire. And so one of the things that our work demonstrates is that, if we identify these areas where thinning treatments can do the most good, because they've got the highest probability of stand replacing fire, we can then use prescribed fire, which is significantly cheaper to treat the other areas, right? The areas where we don't want to thin first, or it's too expensive to thin first. And the numbers Carol presented for Colorado, $800 to $5,000 an acre. I would say that here in New Mexico we're probably around say $500-600 to a couple $1,000 an acre, depending on the ground. And then there's prescribed fire at $50 an acre, right? And so if we can get the work done with prescribed burning, it also helps reintroduce this natural disturbance process, which is how we gain stability for the carbon in these ecosystems. And so really it's looking at our landscapes with an eye toward where does the risk lie, right? So it's kind of like, the variable like car insurance rates, right? We're looking for the 16-year-old drivers, so to speak, on the landscape where we can allocate those expensive treatments and help gain some benefit in terms of reducing the chance that stand replacing fire covers a large fraction of the landscape. So the other thing is, in thinking about this in terms of like your typical kind of carbon market perspective, carbon project, one of the challenges that some folks seem to have is this idea that, when we go in and we cut down trees and we light the place on fire, we're reducing the amount of carbon stored in that ecosystem. And so, and that kind of runs counter to everything we think about in terms of a carbon offset project. But, if we actually back up and think about carbon dynamics in these ecosystems and why there's so much carbon in these historically frequent fire forests to begin with, it's because we have, basically imposed our will on these systems and put fires out for a very long time. And basically we have built up the carbon stock beyond what the ecosystem can sustain under prevailing climate and natural disturbance conditions. And so if you're thinking about it from a treatment perspective and a carbon offset project perspective, part of this is, bringing the carbon stock down to what is sustainable. And then the other piece is how do we structure that carbon stock so that it's more resistant to loss from wildfire. And so a big piece of that is, Malcolm had mentioned things like ladder fuels and these small trees that have grown in with fire suppression. That's what we're talking about thinning. We want to maintain fewer larger trees, and so aggregate the carbon into those fewer larger trees, and then that helps bring stability to the system from a wildfire perspective. And so we're really talking about, in areas where we need to thin, there is this initial reduction in the standing stock of carbon. Part of that's just a necessity due to the biophysics of the system. And then part of that is, the fact that we want to restructure what accumulates in the future. So the remaining trees are going to continue to grow, and we want to allocate that additional carbon storage into larger trees. And then in thinking about the regular emissions from surface fire, so if we're going to use prescribed fire or managed wildfire as a way to maintain this important process in these ecosystems, we need to account for those emissions, and we also need to consider those emissions in the context of the alternative, which is a do-nothing approach, right? And then we have big stand replacing wildfire. And so you can have a relatively large number of prescribed fires happen in a given piece of land, and then you sum those emissions up, and it's going to be equivalent to, say, one significant wildfire event over that same, area. The difference is that significant wildfire event is going to have a much larger fraction that results in tree killing fire and stops that forest from continuing to take up carbon. So from a kind of project perspective here, if we think about the ecosystem one at a scale that's large enough to account for this process, this landscape process of fire, and over timelines that are relevant to the process we're talking about, and also the lifespan of the organisms we're talking about managing, so several hundred years with trees, we've got to think at least in terms of, kind of multi-decadal planning for a carbon offset project under these conditions. And then also recognize that we're dealing with not just, some ton of carbon on the landscape. We've got biophysical constraints on how much carbon any given landscape will support. We've got changing probabilities of disturbance occurring, whether those be from drought, insects, or wildfire. And we've got the effect that management can have in mitigating some of those. And so when all these pieces come together and we think over the right temporal and spatial scales, we can start to get a handle on a way to basically commoditize the carbon in these systems and help pay for some of this work. And I think with that, I'll pass it back over to you, John, and we can get on with the discussion point if that works.
That does work. Thank you. Thank you all for your initial comments here. Coming back probably to you, Matt, on this, is that this is a very complex area. You can imagine with collaborative groups like that Carol works with, that there may be more than one area, one group that's working in these treatments, and their treatments may actually affect each other in terms of the quantification, because when you think beyond where the actual treatment takes place, there's this effect on the impact area or the balance of the fireshed. It's very data intensive to think about that and keep up with the changes in forest structure. What do you think about an interagency or a Forest Service task force that took over the data management requirements of this? Or can you comment on the data needs for a successful program?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're talking about significant amounts of data, right? So we need to build all the data layers necessary to characterize the landscape. But then the other thing that you're talking about is really like as projects occur within a particular watershed or fireshed, how does the effect of a given area that's treated influence the probability of stand replacing fire in another area, right? And I think that there's two ways you could go about that. One would be to model each additional project acre treated and think about it that way, which makes it even more data intensive and more effort intensive. Or, start with a landscape condition, thinking about how we can find these leverage places where, project acres help project acres of treatment help mitigate some of the risk of stand replacing fire across that landscape, and then not re-estimate where to allocate treatment locations after a particular project area is treated, right? So just starting from the assumption that if we treat these areas based on risk, we're going to end up with some net change in the overall landscape risk, and accept that that we may not get optimal outcome without doing additional modeling, but the additional benefits you could get from doing additional modeling are small enough to not necessarily warrant the additional expense. And so, those kind of the two philosophies. I would tend toward the, do the modeling up front and then work from that in terms of the way I think about it. And then two, it's like, there's a couple of different pieces at play. There's the data side and the modeling side. And, I think the data side is going to be comprised of both Forest Service, forest inventory data, satellite data, the JEDI mission with spaceborne LiDAR from NASA is going to be an important contributor to this. But then there's also the modeling side, right? And that's one of those things that is going to evolve over time, particularly as our tools and data improve. We'll want to revisit some of those modeling things. So I think there's a role to play for a collaborative approach to dealing with this, and it may not just lie in the hands of one particular agency or another.
Very good. Yeah, my concern. Oops. Yeah, I thought I was on mute. My concern is that if it comes down to modeling at each independent activity, that it's going to limit accessibility to who does these projects, and I think we need to figure out how to make them as accessible as possible.
John, if I could add, there's some already information though that we can use at this point in time. So for example, looking at the Ponderosa pine forests in Colorado, our current best informed thought on this is that if we're treating 20% of a given landscape, we are going to start to change fire behavior. And so, it's going to be a big lift, but there's already information to feed into that lift, and that can help us make rational and intelligent decisions as we move forward, I think.
Thank you, Carol. We have a question from the audience. This is from Andrea Tuttle, and it probably isn't so directly focused on carbon projects, but it is focused on what kind of treatments are needed for resilience. And this is the question. The fire conversations in California always lump all vegetation types together and prescribe the same list of treatments. But in fact, fires in Southern California chaparral are different from those in the conifer range of the Sierra and the coast. So we need regional approaches. Please comment on how we can develop a more fine-grained, sophisticated approach to treatments, funding, project design, based on where you're at and what your ecosystem looks like. And I made up that ecosystem term. I think it fits. And Malcolm, you might want to start with that one.
Yeah, I'm glad I got this question, or we got this question, because it's a constant source for frustration amongst fire and forest ecologists in California. It's just assumed we have one monolithic fire problem, and that is not at all the case whatsoever. In fact, if you actually look at the numbers that CAL FIRE keeps in terms of destructiveness of fires, by far and away the largest or most destructive fires for structures as well as human casualties are in chaparral oak woodland systems. Used to be predominantly in Southern California. Now, with climate change, it looks like we're getting more of them in Sonoma, and the Camp Fire up in Northern California is starting to propagate these problem fires. But there's much different things going on with those systems. I mean, you fuels treatments don't do you any good in chaparral or oak woodland systems. They just, 6 months later, they've grown back. You've got much more of a problem that has to do with zoning regulations, people building in places that are prone to burning up. And it's a different ball of wax, frankly, than the forest system. And so it doesn't do us any good to lump everything together and then just debate, if we had proper forest management, we could have solved that issue. Oh no, it's all climate change driven. And you can guess which politicians used to say those on each side of the issue. But I think an intelligent way to move this discussion forward is to realize there are different fire regimes and different fire problems, and they require different fire solutions.
Uh-oh, John's frozen.
So I was going to turn it back over to John, but I guess Matt or Carol, if you want to comment.
Well, yeah, we have the oak issue. But this year we had, the fires this summer in last summer, I should say, in northern Colorado. They burned in mixed conifer ecosystems, which are different than the Ponderosa pine. They burned in lodgepole. They actually burned over the Continental Divide. The East Troublesome burned over the divide. We're talking, above timberline, but there was enough vegetation to carry the fire over the peak and then start back in timber on the other side. And they are all different. And we don't necessarily have a good scientific consensus in all of those different ecosystems of what treatment looks like to get to ecological resilience and the social resilience. Where are we building houses? Where are we building infrastructure? So that is a continuing saga, I think, and it's a great question. And I don't know if Matt has more.
Yeah, I think that I agree with both Carol and Malcolm. It's I think one of the unfortunate things is that all too often people will look for the simple answer, right? And it's like, oh well, we've got the nuts and bolts of this worked out in one location. We'll just slap it down over here too, and expect that it's going to be a beneficial outcome. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. And so we also like to look for things that are easy for us, right? It makes it, if I'm a homeowner, it's not my problem if it's a vegetation thing that's 300 yards from my house, right? Even though, it is my problem because I chose to build a house in this location or whatever. And we need to think about the way that we live within these landscapes, and the hazards that entails, and, also be willing to walk away if necessary. Because there are some locations where they're just going to continue to burn and burn and burn, and there's no amount of vegetation management other than probably an amount we're unwilling to pay for that's going to solve that problem.
It's similar to people with beachfront homes. There's places where you should not build a house because it's going to be hit by a hurricane time and again. There's places you shouldn't build a house because it's going to be a wildfire time and again.
Well, I am back. I hope you all can hear me. I disappeared for a little bit. I had some internet problems, and I see that we do have a good question that came in, and it's related to the carbon accounting for a carbon program. And here's the question, and I hope to get it out before any new internet problems come along. But it's my understanding that given the carbon emissions associated with fuel reduction strategies and the limited number of acres that actually burn each year, the numbers don't line up to demonstrate that a given fuels reduction project will actually reduce carbon emissions because of the low likelihood that a fire occurs on those treated acres. Can you comment on this challenge and the likelihood that a wildfire reduction-based carbon methodology could be developed? And I'll throw that out there to all of you. It seems like it gets to a temporal issue of quantification.
Yeah, it's both a temporal and spatial scale question, right? And then the other piece is it really has to do with we have a certain probability. You go stand out in a forest, right? And there's some probability that patch of ground burns in a given year, right? And we tend to estimate those probabilities based on historical data. And so if you're, going back to say the 1970s, all the way back to the 70s, and you're using, multiple decades to estimate what the probability is that a patch of ground burns, and then you re-estimate it using the last, say, decade, you're going to get different answers, right? Because we've seen a lot more fire in the last decade than we'd have since the basically the 70s to the 2010 or whatever. And so, we need to think about how the probability of wildfire occurring at a given location is changing or increasing over time. And then, that's going to factor into influence the viability of a carbon project. And so if we think about, you take your typical like carbon offset project, and it's the lifespan is somewhere between 40 and 100 years for how long that carbon has to be stored in the landscape, depending on the particular program. And the probability that in a fire-prone landscape that the probability that a patch of that landscape is going to burn, we would expect to go up over the next through the end of this century, right? So over the lifespan of the project. And so we have to think about that piece, and then the other piece is really what as it changes over time, what does that mean in terms of the likelihood that any given treated area will interact with wildfire, right? And so kind of getting back to that treatment optimization piece I was talking about, where we locate thinning treatments based on risk, and then we use prescribed fire everywhere else. If we are restoring fire to these ecosystems so that we're restoring function to the ecosystem to help stabilize that carbon, and we've got regular ecologically appropriate fire occurring on that landscape, if you have an unintended ignition occur, it's 100% chance that it's going to interact with some area that you've treated because you've restored fire to that landscape. And the effect of that unintended ignition is going to be negligible. It's going to be what it should be in that ecosystem. And so it's flipping around, getting away from this idea that we need to account for the effects of treatment and the likelihood that treatment interacts with wildfire on, in the next 10 years, and start thinking about it in terms of, over the course of we restore this process to the ecosystem, and how does the probability of wildfire occurring in that landscape change with additional warming and drying?
Thank you, Matt. I'd like to ask a question about funding. We know CAL FIRE is putting about $1 billion, or the state is putting about $1 billion into resilient forests that includes this type of work. Not sure how far that's going to go, and I wonder if you can comment on why we need to seek out other, and this is for all of the panelists, why we need to seek out other sources of funding. And can a carbon market that attempts to bring in private dollars be beneficial in this space?
Absolutely. I mean, again, just looking in Colorado, we have a $12 billion backlog, according to the best analysis that we have to date, which is our last update of the Forest Action Plan. We're not going to get $12 billion miraculously drop out of the sky for us. So the more we have some kind of private investment vehicle helping, we're leveraging, we're getting more landscape, we're changing fire behavior across a landscape so that we can improve outcomes down the line. One of the things that I think when, on the last question that is tickling in my brain is, so the first fire I engaged with was Buffalo Creek. Burned in Colorado in 1996. It was 11,700 acres. At that time, it was the largest fire in modern Colorado history. So in European Americans in Colorado, 11,700 acres was the biggest fire. There's still no trees growing in the Buffalo Creek fire. So when you have these complete stand replacing fires, we don't get that. That carbon stock is not only gone, but the regrowth of new trees coming in is not happening. A lodgepole ecosystem, that's a different one. They tend to come back, but this year's fires happened in areas where we had beetle kill 10 years earlier. So what new baby trees were coming up in the lodgepole from the beetle kill off, all just burned. I think this is going to be a complete stand replacing fire in those ecosystems. So when we look at these questions, it is complex, but we need to figure out how do we get investments to help make this work happen if we want to have forests in the next 100 years.
Yeah, and go ahead, Malcolm.
I was going to say, I think Carol raises a lot of good points. I sometimes think of this as like, even though California's put $1 billion into this, it's actually a pretty small amount considering the size of the problem. And there's starting to be discussions about how do we leverage that money. And I kind of think of the insufferable fundraising efforts that NPR does, where you try to get matching funds between different things. And I know that CAL FIRE is starting to consider that kind of approach, because $1 billion sounds like a lot, but frankly, in the size of this issue, it's really pocket change. And so trying to get some of the municipalities that have water resources that are coming from the headwaters of these forests interested in this, as well as the carbon market, as well as many of the other ecosystem processes, trying to get a matching set of funds so that you're not just trying to drive it all on the $1 billion. I think is going to have to be a way that we go forward with this, because frankly, it's just not nearly enough money, even though it sounds like a lot.
And, to piggyback on that, Carol had mentioned the Santa Fe Municipal Watershed. Basically from Albuquerque north, we're all part of the Rio Grande Water Fund, these different municipalities. And so I pay money on my water bill to pay for forest treatments in the upland watershed. And is that going to pay for all of it? Absolutely not. The basic fact of the matter is that, we've neglected these landscapes and actually taken action in the form of fire suppression to put them in the position they're currently in. It's going to take a lot of money to get us out of that. It's going to have to come from multiple sources, water, carbon, stuff like that. Some of these things we don't value especially well. And so we're just going to have to be willing to invest in ecosystem function, the types of management that will yield good ecosystem function in these systems. And that's just the cost of doing business to, take care of some of the problems that we've created.
We have an interesting question that came in, and the question is, are carbon offsets the right tool to solve the problem? And I have a comment on that before I let it out to the panelists, and that is that right now, I know working with the reserve that we're focused on trying to get the quantification right. And what does that mean? That means, looking at the probabilities and looking at risks and looking just to get the quantification right. Where the funding comes from is probably, we're agnostic to that. I wonder if you guys have put any other thoughts into how you can use a value that's derived from the analysis of treatments and the perceived emissions reductions, and where else that money might come from. If it's not a carbon market, if it's some other form of mitigation dollars, or just simple recognition of the benefits of these treatments.
I think that the nice thing that carbon offsets have to add to this is that it's a way that we're basically valuing some of the stuff that we get from forests that's non-timber, right? So we have markets in place where you go cut down trees and haul them out and turn them into stuff. But it's like carbon, water, these sorts of quote unquote ecosystem services are really essential to us as a species. And I don't think. If we adequately valued climate regulation, right, in the form that natural ecosystems provide, and we adequately valued the water that comes out of natural systems, we'd probably have all the money we need to manage forests for ecosystem function. But the fact is that I know here in Albuquerque, my water bill is way cheaper than it ought to be, based on how much water. Even the tiered system where you spend more, the more it goes up. It's like we don't price the externalities associated with burning fossil fuel, right? And if we did, that fossil fuel would cost a lot more. And so if we're looking at, the U.S. As a country, if we're looking at our carbon emissions and the fact that we report net carbon emissions, so we're subtracting off forest carbon uptake to the tune of roughly 12% a year, we should have the resources to manage our forests, and carbon should help contribute to subsidizing that.
But one of the other things I think that's worth bringing up is that at this point, Colorado is already, from our forests, has become a net emitter. That's not a good thing. I mean, historically, our forests were sinks. They were taking up carbon more than they were letting it go. Well, between insect and disease die-off and wildfire and just general poor forest health conditions, our forests are now net emitters. And as I said, our big fires are not regrowing a new forest for the future. So between the two, we're going more in the hole from a forest carbon calculation. And so forest carbon could be part of the way we help get out of that hole. It's only one piece. It's not a solution. It's not like, oh, if we have a carbon protocol, it's all good and we're going to take care of our $12 billion backlog. No, but it's at least a part of a puzzle.
Yeah, speaking of another part of that puzzle, I think that we've come a long way in the last 15 years. As a forester, I remember talking about the need to get to fuel reductions and prescribed fire, and it seemed like it was an impossible hurdle to get over. And we're doing it now. In fact, I get emails during the winter season from the local Fire Safe Council here in Mendocino County looking for volunteers to help other citizens on some of their prescribed burns. I would wonder if you would like to comment on this movement of citizen-led prescribed burns in trainings or for the burn bosses that are leading these groups. Have you seen that in Colorado and New Mexico?
We have definitely seen it. I run a nonprofit. We have a certified burn crew. We don't tend to use just Joe Q citizen volunteers who we send a note out to, hey, anybody want to show up because of insurance issues. But there's definitely a place for non-federal, non-state partners. And that includes interested citizens. They have training, they have to be part of a protocol. Colorado has worked out through our Division of Fire Management and FMPC, I can never remember what their acronym stands for, a program for, buying private citizens to do fire on their own land. So that's going on. Mexico has a great example through the Forest Stewards Guild, who's created a module. And Matt might know more about.
We just actually in the state passed a piece of legislation this last session that removed some of the liability constraints for non-governmental organizations burning on private land. And like Carol was saying, the Forest Stewards Guild was instrumental in that, along with some other NGOs. But basically the way it works is that the folks leading the burn have to have the same burn boss qualifications as a federal or state governmental burn boss. It's just that they don't have to have that umbrella of, kind of government over them. And so they still have to follow the same protocols, write a prescription, best practices, all of that in order to manage the risk associated with that. But it just removes some of the liability challenges for them doing that on private land, as long as they're following these requirements, best practices.
And I would point out, I think sometimes we forget that the southeastern part of the United States burns at a level that shows that this can be done. The Southeast often burns 7 million acres a year, and fire is part of the culture and the way that they understand how to manage the forests. And many of those fires are conducted by a whole array of organizations that do it. So I don't think it's out of reach at all. It's just a question of us trying to figure out how to implement some of those best practices in conditions that are a little bit more complex because we don't have such flat topography or such wet summer rains. But it certainly shows that it can be done, and there's a real significant role for an array of people putting fire on the landscape.
You're muted, John.
Sorry about that. They tell you that you're muted and they put the sign right in front of the mute button so you can't get to it. So, but on that positive note, I want to thank all of you for being part of the panel. And yeah, thank you very much. It's been a great panel.
Thank you.